The night Evan called me boring, something inside me went very still. Not angry, not broken. Just still. Like the sound after a slammed door, when all that's left is silence you didn't know could hurt. We'd been sitting in the living room, me folding laundry, him scrolling through his phone, the blue glow of the screen reflecting off his smirk. I had just asked if he wanted to watch the new documentary together, and he laughed that low, careless laugh that used to make me feel adored. "Lena," he said, not even looking up, "you really are something else. You never change, do you? Same routine, same show, same everything. You're just—" He paused, his thumb flicking another notification away. "Boring." The word landed like ice water on skin. I remember setting down the folded towel, feeling its warmth seep into my fingers. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just looked at him, my husband of 10 years, and wondered when exactly he'd stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as background noise. Later that night, after he fell asleep snoring softly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My heart didn't ache the way I expected it to. Instead, it whispered, "Enough." Evan had been different lately, secretive, distant, always texting someone with that half smile he never wore for me anymore. Once, I caught a glimpse of a name flashing across his screen, Sophie. When I asked, he said she was a new hire at his firm. "Just work stuff, Lena. Don't start your drama." I didn't. Not then. But it's strange how the word boring can light a fire under the calmest woman. The next few days, I started noticing things I'd ignored before, how he suddenly cared more about his cologne, his hair, the gym. He began working late on Thursdays and Fridays, coming home smelling faintly of perfume I didn't own. Mara, my best friend, noticed the change too. "You've been too patient, Lena," she told me over coffee one afternoon. Men like Evan, they mistake kindness for weakness. I smiled at her, stirring sugar into my cup. Maybe I've been weak for too long. That evening, while folding another load of laundry, I heard Evan humming in the bathroom, his voice off-key but cheerful. The smell of his expensive shampoo drifted out the one he kept locked away in the cabinet like it was liquid gold. And that's when it hit me. A harmless idea. Silly even. But it made me smile, a real smile, one I hadn't felt in months. If he wanted excitement, maybe I could give him some. The next day, while Evan was at work, I went shopping. I didn't buy dresses or heels or anything for myself. I bought one small, inconspicuous bottle of hair remover cream. The kind that works a little too well if you're not careful. When I got home, I unscrewed the top of his precious shampoo and poured a little out. Then, carefully, I mixed in just enough of the cream to make it look, smell, and feel the same. I shook the bottle, placed it back where it belonged, and cleaned the counter until it gleamed. No one could have guessed. That night, Evan came home whistling. He was in a good mood, suspiciously good. "Got plans tonight," he said casually. "Meeting a client for dinner." "Don't wait up. Client?" I asked softly, not looking up from my book. He nodded, grabbing his things. "Yeah, Sophie. She's new, so I'm showing her the ropes." I closed my book and smiled faintly. "You should look your best then." He winked at me like it was a joke. "Always do, babe." I watched him disappear into the bathroom, the sound of running water filling the apartment. I sat there quietly, heart steady, fingers folded neatly in my lap, and when I heard his panicked yell echo down the hall a few minutes later, a sound that could have woken the dead, I didn't move right away. "Lena." "What the hell? What's happening to my hair?" I waited another beat, then calmly walked toward the door. He stood there in the doorway, towel around his waist, dripping wet, staring into the mirror like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His once perfect dark hair was patchy, uneven, and falling out in clumps onto the tile. His face was pure horror. "Oh my God," he gasped, turning to me. What happened to my hair?" I tilted my head, pretending to think. Maybe that's what happens when you use someone else's shampoo without asking. He blinked, mouth open, unable to form words. Or, I continued gently, maybe it's karma for calling your wife boring. For the first time in a long time, Evan had nothing to say. I turned and walked away, my steps calm, my pulse slow. I didn't laugh. I didn't gloat. But somewhere deep inside, I felt something unclench, something that had been waiting far too long to breathe. That night, while he frantically Googled how to fix chemical hair damage, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, staring at the city lights. The air felt cleaner, lighter, and I thought, maybe this was what freedom felt like, not revenge, not cruelty, but finally standing up and saying, I see myself now. And the funny thing? The next morning he wore a baseball cap to work, and I found a text on his phone from Sophie. Hey, what happened to your hair? He never replied, but I did with a single emoji. The days that followed were oddly quiet, almost peaceful. Evan tiptoed around me like a man walking barefoot over glass. Every time our eyes met, he'd glance away, his hand subconsciously tugging at the brim of his baseball cap. He didn't mention the incident, not once. But I could tell he knew. He wasn't stupid, just arrogant enough to think I'd never fight back. And the silence between us began to take on a strange power, like the quiet before a storm you know is coming. But you can't tell which way the wind will turn. Mara called me that afternoon. So, she said, her voice barely hiding her grin, did he say anything yet? I laughed softly. Not a word. You're a saint, she teased. If I'd done what you did, I'd be wearing a halo and blowing kisses every time he looked at his reflection. I smiled. It's not about payback, Mara. It's about balance. He needed to remember that I'm not invisible. There was a pause on the line. And do you feel seen now? Her question hung in the air, more honest than I expected. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me did feel lighter, but another part, the one that used to believe in us, felt bruised. I realized the prank hadn't been revenge. It was a release, a way of saying goodbye to the woman who kept swallowing her voice for the sake of keeping peace. That night, when Evan came home, I found him standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his scalp. He caught my reflection and froze. Is it going to grow back? He asked quietly, almost like a child. It should, I said, crossing my arms. Hair usually does if you stop lying long enough. His shoulders tensed. Lena, it wasn't, don't, I interrupted gently. Please, don't insult both of us by pretending. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The distance between us felt like an ocean we'd both stopped trying to cross. He sighed and turned away, muttering, You've changed. I smiled faintly. No, I just stopped pretending not to notice. He left the bathroom, and I stayed behind, watching his reflection fade in the fogged mirror. 2 days later, Sophie came by. She arrived at our front door in a sleek beige trench coat, perfume so strong it drifted into the hall. Oh, she said, blinking when I opened the door. Hi, Mrs. Cartwright, I smiled politely. Lena, please. Evan isn't home. Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the entryway like she expected him to appear any second. I just wanted to drop something off. His jacket, he left it at the restaurant last week. Of course, I said softly. You can leave it here. She handed it to me with a tight smile, her nails manicured, her eyes a little too curious. I heard about the hair thing, she blurted, then quickly covered her mouth, embarrassed. I arched a brow. Oh? Gossip travels fast. It's just he said it was some new product that went wrong, she said, her tone uncertain, like she was testing the truth. But it's weird. He never used to be careless like that. I tilted my head. Maybe people change. For a moment, we stood there, two women linked by the same man's lies. She looked younger than me, but her expression held the same disappointment I'd worn for years. Maybe she thought she was special. Maybe she thought she'd be different. I'll tell him you stopped by, I said finally, closing the door with quiet finality. That evening, Evan returned home, looking uneasy. He noticed the jacket folded neatly on the couch. Sophie came by? Yes, I said, stirring a pot on the stove. She mentioned your accident. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. God, she must think I'm a joke now. Maybe, I murmured, turning off the burner. Or maybe she saw you for who you really are. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I said, walking past him, that it's hard to admire a man who treats people like props in his little performance. He didn't follow me this time. Instead, he sat on the couch silent, his reflection in the window barely recognizable. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in months. The next morning, I woke before dawn, made myself coffee, and sat by the window watching the city wake up. When the first light touched the buildings, I realized something simple yet freeing. I didn't need him to say sorry. I didn't need validation or guilt. What I needed was space to rebuild myself. Later that week, Mara came over. We packed a few of my things not because I was running away, but because I wanted a break. A weekend at the lake house, she said. You, me, silence, and no men named Evan. I laughed for the first time in a long while. That sounds perfect. When I left, Evan stood by the door, confused but not protesting. Where are you going? He asked. Somewhere peaceful, I said, grabbing my bag. He frowned. Without telling me? I turned to him, meeting his eyes one last time. You told me once that I never change. Maybe it's time I prove you wrong. He didn't try to stop me. Just stood there, cap in hand, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. As I drove away, the radio played a song we used to dance to in our kitchen. I smiled at the memory, but it didn't hurt anymore. For the first time, the road ahead looked open, uncertain. Yes, but mine. By the time the weekend ended, I felt reborn. I didn't know if Evan would ever apologize, or if we'd end up finding our way back to each other. But I did know this. Sometimes a woman doesn't need revenge or forgiveness, just the courage to stop shrinking in rooms that make her feel invisible. When I returned home, the apartment was clean. A vase of lilies sat on the counter, my favorite. There was a note beside them in Evan's handwriting. You were never boring. I was just blind. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just exhaled, feeling the last of the bitterness drift away. Because the truth was, I wasn't doing this for him anymore. I was doing it for me. When I walked back into our apartment that evening, I could feel the stillness before I even turned on the lights. The lilies on the counter had started to wilt, their petals drooping over the vase, the water slightly cloudy. I stared at them for a moment, realizing how quickly beauty can fade when left unattended, like a marriage neglected long enough to lose its shine. Evan was sitting on the couch, the TV playing low. He looked tired, older somehow, like the weeks had carved fine lines into his once proud face. When he saw me, he stood up slowly, unsure of what to say. Lena, he began carefully, I wasn't sure you'd come back. I placed my bag by the door, keeping my tone neutral. I wasn't sure either, he nodded, glancing toward the lilies. I thought maybe they'd mean something. They do, I said softly. They remind me that everything needs care or it dies quietly. He swallowed hard. You're right. He hesitated, then motioned to the seat across from him. Can we talk? I sat, not out of forgiveness but curiosity. For the first time, he didn't sound defensive. He sounded human. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he said, rubbing his temples, about what you did and why you did it. He let out a short laugh, one that held no humor. At first I was angry, humiliated, honestly, but then I realized I deserved it. I looked at him evenly. Deserved it? He nodded. Yeah, because somewhere along the line, I stopped trying. I took you for granted. You were always there, calm, patient, predictable. I thought that was comfort, but I treated it like complacency. For a moment, I saw the man I'd once fallen in love with, not the arrogant executive who craved admiration, but the boyish version who used to bring me coffee in bed on Sundays and kiss me goodnight like it still mattered. I never wanted to hurt you, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But I did. I got bored with myself, not you. And instead of fixing that, I blamed you for being the reflection of what I'd become. His honesty startled me. I wasn't prepared for it, not after months of gaslighting and distance. Evan, I said quietly, you don't get to make excuses wrapped in apologies. He nodded. I know, I want to make things right, I sighed, leaning back. You can't fix what's been shattered by pretending it only cracked. He looked down, defeated. So what now? The question lingered between us, heavy but necessary. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe we both start being honest about what we want. He met my gaze. Do you still want this, us? The truth was complicated. Part of me wanted to say yes, to cling to the familiar rhythm of our lives. But another part, the stronger, quieter part, wanted peace, independence, space to rediscover the woman I was before marriage dulled my edges. I want it, I admitted, but I don't know if I can. He nodded slowly, as if the words cut but didn't surprise him. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of years pressing between us. Then he reached into his pocket and slid something across the table. A small velvet pouch. What's this? I asked, hesitant. Something I should have given you a long time ago, he said softly. I opened it to find a delicate silver bracelet, simple, elegant, engraved with 2 words, "Still you." He smiled faintly. You used to say that when things got rough. You'd tell me, "I'm still me, Evan. You just stopped looking." I found this last week and thought, maybe you should have it. The gesture was small, but it tugged at something deep in me, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. The kind that comes when someone finally sees you without trying to fix you. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist. Thank you, I whispered. He exhaled, relieved. Does this mean— No, I interrupted gently. It means I hear you. He looked crushed, but he nodded. The next few days were strange. We coexisted like careful strangers, polite, measured, almost tender in our distance. He cooked dinner once, the way he used to when we first married, fumbling with spices and apologizing for overcooking the rice. We laughed about it, and for a fleeting second, the warmth between us felt real again. But when I went to bed that night, I knew deep down that love isn't always enough to rebuild what's been quietly crumbling for years. One morning, Mara stopped by. She took one look at me calm, composed, wearing that silver bracelet and knew, "You're leaving him, aren't you?" She asked softly. I hesitated. Not today. But soon, she smiled, sadness and pride mixing in her eyes. It's about time you started living for yourself. Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk with a blank sheet of paper and began writing a letter, not to Evan, but to myself. Dear Lena, you are not boring. You were never boring. You were just quiet in a world that rewards noise. You were steady in a marriage that only noticed storms. Don't let anyone mistake your calm for emptiness again. By the time I finished, tears blurred the ink, but my heart felt lighter. That evening, Evan came home early. He looked at me with a cautious kind of hope. Dinner? He asked. I smiled faintly. I already ate. He nodded, stepping closer. You've really changed. I've just remembered who I was before you told me who to be, I replied. He didn't have an answer for that. As I turned to leave the room, I saw his reflection in the window again, the man I'd once loved, now watching the woman he no longer controlled walk away. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small in his presence. I felt free, and freedom, I realized, was the most beautiful kind of revenge. The morning after that quiet realization, I woke up before sunrise. The apartment felt different, lighter, as if something heavy had finally lifted. Evan was still asleep, his arm hanging off the side of the bed, the baseball cap resting on the nightstand like a small monument to his humiliation. For a moment, I studied his face. The man I used to love so deeply, the one who could make me laugh until I cried, who once painted the living room at midnight because I'd said I wanted a warmer color. But that version of him was gone, replaced by someone who didn't see me anymore, and maybe I was gone too, replaced by a quieter, wiser version of myself. I got dressed quietly and slipped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, and the first streaks of sunlight were touching the skyline. I wrapped my robe around me, clutching a cup of coffee, and just breathed. Mara's words from the weekend echoed in my head. You've been living small so he could feel big. She was right. I'd spent years shrinking myself to fit into his world, canceling dinners with friends, softening my opinions, even changing my wardrobe because he once said bright colors didn't suit me. I thought compromise was love. I thought being easy to live with meant being loved in return, but now I saw it clearly. I wasn't boring. I was contained, and he had built the container. When I went back inside, Evan was awake. He looked at me from the bed, his expression unreadable. You were up early, he said. I needed air. He nodded slowly. You've been different since the lake? Different how? I asked, pouring myself another cup of coffee. Calm, he said, but also indistant, like you've already decided something and you're just waiting for the right time to say it. I met his gaze. Maybe I have. He flinched, though I hadn't raised my voice. Lena, if this is about what happened about Sophie, I swear it's over. It never even started, I smiled faintly. Evan, you don't have to lie anymore. I'm not angry. Then what are you? He asked. Tired, I said simply. Tired of waiting for a version of you that existed years ago. Tired of living in a story that stopped being ours the moment you started writing secret chapters with someone else. He opened his mouth to protest, but I lifted a hand to stop him. You don't need to defend yourself. You've already shown me who you are, and I've finally learned who I am without you. His jaw tightened, and for a second I thought he might yell. But instead he just sat there, deflated. So what? You're leaving? I took a slow sip of coffee, then nodded. Eventually. I've already started looking for apartments. The silence that followed was thick, like fog between us. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside life going on, indifferent to our unraveling. You can't just walk away from 10 years, Lena, he said quietly. I looked at him, my voice calm but firm. Evan, I already did. You just didn't notice, he blinked, stunned. And in that moment, I realized how unfamiliar this version of me was to him, the one who didn't shrink, didn't apologize, didn't tremble under his disappointment. I packed a suitcase that afternoon. Just enough clothes for a week, my journal, a few photos that still made me smile, and the silver bracelet he'd given me, not as a reminder of him, but of the promise I made to myself, still you. As I zipped the bag, Evan appeared at the doorway. You're really going through with this? Yes, his voice softened. Is there anything I can say to change your mind? I paused, then shook my head. Not anymore. You already had every chance. He nodded slowly, a muscle in his jaw twitching. You know, for what it's worth, I don't think you're boring. I think you're the most fascinating woman I've ever met. I just didn't know how to keep up with you. The honesty in his voice was unexpected, and it stung. Maybe someday, I said, picking up my bag, you'll find someone who makes you want to keep up. I just can't be her anymore. He stepped aside, and I walked past him. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. There was no dramatic goodbye, no slammed door, just quiet certainty. Outside, the sky had turned a deep gold. I called a cab, and as I waited on the curb, I realized how light I felt, as if years of invisible weight had finally lifted. When I arrived at Mara's place, she greeted me with her trademark smirk. So, you did it? I did, I said softly, and I don't regret it. She poured me a glass of wine and handed it over. To new beginnings, she said. I clinked my glass against hers. To remembering who we are. That night, I slept in her guest room, surrounded by laughter from the TV and the faint scent of lavender candles. For the first time in years, I didn't dream about Evan. I didn't dream about the past. I dreamed about a woman walking barefoot along the shore, hair loose, eyes bright, smiling at the horizon like she'd finally made peace with her reflection. And when I woke the next morning, sunlight spilling across the sheets, I realized that woman was me. Freedom didn't look like running away or slamming doors. It looked like this quiet, steady, and deeply earned. A week later, Evan texted me. Just one message. I hope you find what you're looking for. I stared at the screen for a while before replying. I already have. Then I turned off my phone, stepped outside, and let the wind carry the last echoes of who I used to be. For the first time in a long time, Lena Cartwright wasn't someone's wife, someone's reflection, someone's second thought. She was just Lena, and that, I decided, was more than enough. The days after leaving Evan were not the triumphant, cinematic montage I'd imagined. They were quiet, sometimes heavy, sometimes beautifully light. Freedom has a strange texture. It feels exhilarating and terrifying all at once. At first, every small act of independence felt awkward. Making breakfast for one, folding laundry for one, listening to the silence of my own apartment, the kind that doesn't echo with someone else's footsteps or criticism. But over time, that silence began to sound like peace. Mara helped me find a small rental downtown, nothing fancy, but filled with sunlight and the kind of stillness that invited healing. On my first night there, I opened all the windows, let the cool air flow in, and stood barefoot in the middle of the empty living room. It was quiet except for the hum of the city below, and for once I didn't feel lonely. I felt possible. I unpacked slowly, carefully. Each item I pulled from my suitcase felt like a choice. The soft blanket Evan used to complain about, it sheds too much, went on my couch. The stack of books he said I'd never finish lined the window ledge. I even bought a bright yellow throw pillow, the kind he used to call too loud. Every detail whispered, I exist beyond what you allowed me to be. One evening, Mara stopped by with takeout and 2 bottles of wine. She looked around the apartment approvingly. "You've turned this place into something that feels like you," she said. I smiled. I didn't realize how much of me I'd hidden. "You didn't hide," she corrected. "You adapted. But now you're free to be loud again." I laughed a sound that felt unfamiliar in the best way. "Loud might take a while." We ate on the floor, surrounded by half-open boxes and candles flickering against the walls. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and that was more than I'd felt in years. Later that night, after she left, I sat at my desk and pulled out my journal. I wrote for hours not about Evan, but about me. About who I was before him, who I became with him, and who I wanted to be after him. The truth spilled out easily. I don't hate him. I just don't need him anymore. I'm not broken. I'm rebuilding, and I'm finally done apologizing for wanting more. When I closed the journal, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace without guilt. A few days later, while walking home from the market, I passed a small salon on the corner. Through the window, I saw women laughing, talking, their reflections glowing under soft lights. I caught my own reflection in the glass, the same simple haircut I'd had for years. Without thinking too hard, I walked inside. The stylist, a cheerful woman named Naomi, greeted me. "What are we doing today?" I hesitated. "Something different," she smiled knowingly. "Different as in new woman different?" "Exactly that," I said, laughing. An hour later, I barely recognized myself. My long, safe brown hair was now a soft shoulder-length cut with lighter streaks, warm, alive. For the first time, I didn't worry about whether Evan would approve. I just loved it. As I stepped back out onto the street, the breeze caught the ends of my hair, and I felt like I'd stepped into a new chapter, one I was writing entirely on my own. That evening, I got a text from an unknown number. "You look beautiful. Lena, Naomi posted a photo of your new look. I hope that's okay." I frowned, then smiled when I saw the signature. Sophie. It took me a moment to process it. I hadn't spoken to her since that awkward visit to my house weeks ago. "Thank you," I replied simply. "It's okay. I'm glad you saw it." After a pause, her next message came through. "He told me you left." "For what it's worth." "You did the right thing." I stared at the screen, surprised by the kindness in her tone. "I think we both learned something the hard way." I wrote back. She replied with a single message. "Some men only realize what they lost when they see what peace looks like without them." I didn't respond, but her words lingered with me long after I set the phone down. Over the next few weeks, Evan didn't reach out again. I learned from mutual friends that he'd taken some time off work, started therapy, and was trying to figure himself out. For once, that didn't make me angry. I hoped he did. Just not for me, for himself. Meanwhile, I began discovering parts of life I'd forgotten. I joined a pottery class on Saturdays. I went on walks at sunset. I started cooking meals just because they made me happy, not because someone else would be impressed. One evening, while shaping clay at the studio, Naomi looked over and said, "You've got a good touch." Gentle but sure. I smiled, rolling the clay between my palms. It's funny. I used to think I was soft. Now I think I'm just steady. That night, I took home the first bowl I ever made. It was uneven, imperfect, but beautiful in its own way. I placed it on my coffee table and filled it with seashells from the lake trip with Mara. A reminder that beauty doesn't need symmetry, it just needs honesty. Weeks turned into months. The ache I once carried for what could have been slowly faded into gratitude for what was. The hair prank, the arguments, the heartbreak, they all became small chapters in a much bigger story. My story. One afternoon, while cleaning the apartment, I came across the bracelet Evan had given me. Still you. I held it in my hand for a long moment before fastening it around my wrist again. It no longer reminded me of him. It reminded me of who I had always been, even when I forgot. Later that night, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My hair shorter, my eyes brighter, a quiet strength in my expression. I whispered to the woman staring back at me, "You're not boring. You were just waiting to be seen." And for the first time, she smiled not because someone told her to, but because she finally believed it herself. Spring crept in softly that year, like it knew I needed gentleness. The trees outside my apartment bloomed pale pink, scattering petals across the sidewalks like confetti from some unseen celebration. I started leaving my windows open more often, letting in the smell of rain, coffee, and possibility. My mornings were quiet but full meditation, a slow breakfast, journaling by the window. It wasn't the kind of life that made headlines, but it was the kind that made peace. For the first time in years, I felt content just existing, without needing to prove anything to anyone. One morning, while sipping coffee on my small balcony, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Hi, Lena, it's Evan. Hope I'm not intruding." I froze. It had been almost 4 months since we'd spoken. I'd imagined what I'd say if he ever reached out again, sometimes fierce, sometimes forgiving, but now that he had, all I felt was calm curiosity. "Hi, Evan, you're not intruding," I typed back. His reply came quickly. "I wanted to say thank you." I frowned slightly. "Thank you? For what?" "For leaving." It forced me to face myself. I've been in therapy for a while now, and I'm learning a lot. About how I treated people. About how I treated you. I stared at his words, unsure what to feel. There was no bitterness, no manipulation, just quiet sincerity. "I'm glad you're doing that," I wrote. "You needed to." "Yeah," he replied. "I did. And I needed to tell you that you didn't deserve the way I made you feel. You were never boring. I was just too distracted to see how good I had it." A soft ache bloomed in my chest, not the kind that hurts, but the kind that reminds you of something that once mattered. "Thank you," I wrote back. "It means more than you think." "I don't expect anything," he added. "I just wanted you to know." I stared at the last message for a long time before locking my phone and setting it aside. Closure, I realized, doesn't always arrive with tears or apologies. Sometimes it comes as a quiet acknowledgement that the chapter truly ended. That day, I took myself out to lunch at a small cafe near the park. The waiter recognized me from the pottery class. "You're the one who made that beautiful uneven bowl," he said with a grin. I laughed. "That's me. It's still sitting on my table, proudly imperfect." "Best kind of art," he said, pouring my tea. I sat there for hours, watching people pass by, couples holding hands, children chasing pigeons, an old man sketching near the fountain. The world felt alive again, like I'd been watching it through glass for years and was finally breathing the same air. When I got home, I found Mara sitting on my doorstep holding 2 iced coffees. "Why do you always look like you've just figured out the meaning of life?" she teased. "Because maybe I have," I said, laughing. "It's simple, really. Stop waiting for someone else to see your worth." She raised her cup. "I'll drink to that." We sat on my couch, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "You know, Lena, I think you're finally ready." "For what?" "For something new. Maybe love, maybe adventure, maybe just whatever comes next." I tilted my head. "Love? That feels far away." "Maybe," she said with a smile. "But I've seen that look before, the one in your eyes when you talk about life now. You're open again. That's the first step." Her words lingered long after she left. That evening, I went for a walk by the river. The city lights shimmered on the water, and I thought about how endings have a way of teaching you beginnings. I had spent so long grieving the version of myself that loved him that I hadn't realized how much beauty there was in the woman who survived him. As I stood by the railing, I noticed someone sketching a few feet away, a man in his 40s, wearing glasses and a faded denim jacket. He looked up and smiled politely before returning to his sketch pad. There was something gentle about him, something unhurried. After a few minutes, he glanced my way again. "Sorry, I hope I'm not bothering you. I'm drawing the skyline, but you're standing right where the light hits best." I smiled. "Then I'll take that as a compliment." "It is," he said, smiling back. "I'm Daniel, by the way." "Lena," he nodded. "Nice to meet you, Lena. You live around here?" "Not far," I said. "Just a few blocks down." "Good place for starting over," he said, almost as if he could read my thoughts. I laughed softly. "You have no idea." We talked for a while about art, the city, small things. It wasn't flirtatious, just easy. I hadn't realized how rare that was. When we finally parted ways, he handed me a small torn page from his sketchbook, a quick pencil drawing of the river, with the faint outline of a woman standing by the railing. "I'll finish it someday," he said. "Maybe I'll see you around." I watched him walk away, the paper fluttering slightly in my hand. For the first time since leaving Evan, my heart didn't feel guarded. It just felt open, not waiting for love, but welcoming life again. That night, as I placed the sketch beside my pottery bowl, I realized how far I'd come. From the woman who whispered her worth to the one who now lived it out loud, no grand declarations, no dramatic revenge. Just quiet strength, born from rediscovery. I turned off the lights, crawled into bed and whispered to the dark, "I'm still me, but better." And for the first time, the silence that followed didn't echo, it answered back. A few weeks passed, and life began to find its rhythm again. Work, morning coffee, evening walks by the river, each day flowing into the next with a soft kind of calm that felt earned. It wasn't excitement I wanted anymore. It was steadiness, the kind that comes after the storm, when you finally learned how to breathe again. Daniel and I started bumping into each other more often. At first, it seemed coincidental: the cafe near the river, the bookstore on Maple Street, the Sunday farmers market. But then one day he smiled and said, "Maybe the universe is just better at planning than we are." I laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Or maybe you just spend too much time near my favorite places." "Guilty," he said, his smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. He was easy to talk to, not because we shared the same interests, but because he listened without interrupting. When I spoke, he didn't try to fix or explain me. He just heard me, and that, I realized, was rarer than love itself. One afternoon, while we sat on a park bench sharing a bag of roasted almonds, he asked, "So, what's your story, Lena?" I hesitated. "Which version?" "The true one," he said gently. I looked out at the river, the sun glinting off the water. "I was married once. For a long time, it ended. Not dramatically, but quietly. Like a candle burning out," he nodded thoughtfully. "Did it hurt?" "Yes," I said, honest but steady. "But it also healed." "Sometimes pain does both," he smiled. "You sound like someone who's written her own ending. Or maybe her own beginning," I said softly. We sat in silence after that, not awkwardly, but comfortably. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. When I got home that evening, I found an email from Evan. My stomach tightened instinctively, though the sharpness of that reaction had dulled with time. I hovered over the message before opening it. Subject, "Just wanted to say goodbye." I exhaled slowly and began to read. "Lena, I'm moving out of the city for a while. New job, new space, new start. I don't know what I'm looking for yet, but I know what I lost, not you as my wife, but you as my mirror. You showed me parts of myself I wasn't brave enough to face. I hope you're happy. Truly. You deserve peace, even if it's not with me." EI stared at the screen, letting the words settle. There was no manipulation, no begging, just quiet acceptance. Maybe we had both finally reached the same understanding, that love sometimes ends not because it wasn't real, but because it stopped growing. I typed a short reply. "Evan, I wish you peace too. Take care of yourself." Lena, and just like that, the last thread between us loosened, not cut, not ripped, just gently released. That night, I walked to the river again. Daniel was there, sketching as always. He looked up when he saw me and smiled. "You again." "Me again," I said, settling beside him. He glanced at me curiously. "You look lighter tonight?" "I said goodbye to something that's been haunting me," I replied. "And it feels good." He closed his sketchbook. "Goodbyes are just doors to something better, you know." I smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who's been through a few." "Maybe," he said. "But you sound like someone who finally learned how to walk through them." The air grew cooler as the sun dipped below the skyline. We sat quietly, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. It struck me how different this moment felt from anything I'd known before. There was no rush, no pressure, no desperate need to define what we were. Just two people existing in the same piece. When I got home that night, I took out my journal again. I wrote only one line. Sometimes the best revenge is not becoming bitter, but becoming whole. Days turned into weeks, and those quiet river conversations became a gentle ritual. Sometimes we talked for hours, other times we simply watched the world go by. He told me about his art, how he used to design architectural sketches for a firm before deciding to freelance. "I wanted to draw for myself again," he said. "Not for deadlines." I told him about my pottery class, about how shaping clay had taught me more about life than any therapist ever could. It's forgiving, I said. If you mess up, you just reshape it. It doesn't hold grudges, he chuckled. Sounds like we could all learn something from clay. Over time, something began to grow between us, not a spark or a wildfire, but a quiet warmth that didn't demand attention. It was the kind of connection that sneaks up on you, steady and sure. One Sunday, while walking through the market, he handed me a small sketchbook. For you, he said. I opened it and found pages of drawings, the park bench, the river, the skyline, and me. Always me, sometimes smiling, sometimes lost in thought. I drew what peace looked like, he said softly. Tears pricked my eyes before I could stop them. Daniel? He shook his head gently. You don't have to say anything. Just keep it. That night, I placed the sketchbook on my nightstand beside my bracelet. Two symbols of the woman I'd become, one given in guilt, one given in grace. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling gratitude instead of regret. Evan had once said I never changed. He was wrong. I had changed, I'd grown roots in places I didn't even know existed. And maybe, just maybe this time, I'd finally found someone who saw me bloom. Summer arrived like a soft exhale, golden mornings, warm evenings, and that lazy hum that makes everything feel possible again. The city glowed differently now, or maybe it was just me seeing it with new eyes. I'd spent so many years watching life through someone else's reflection that I had forgotten how vibrant it could be when viewed on my own terms. Daniel and I had settled into a quiet companionship. We didn't label it, didn't rush it, didn't question it. Some nights we'd sit by the river, eating ice cream and laughing about nothing. Other times we'd walk for miles without speaking, just letting the rhythm of our steps fill the silence. There was no pretense, no expectation, just ease. The kind I'd never known and loved before. One afternoon, he invited me to an art exhibit he was featured in. It's nothing fancy, he said, scratching the back of his neck. Just a small local show. But it would mean a lot if you came. I smiled. I wouldn't miss it. When I arrived that evening, the gallery was filled with the quiet hum of admiration, people murmuring softly, glasses of wine clinking, the faint scent of paint and polish in the air. Daniel stood near one of his pieces, greeting guests with his usual calm warmth. When he saw me, his eyes lit up, and I felt that same flutter I'd almost forgotten existed. Lena, he said, his smile soft but sure. You came. Of course, I said, my voice steady, though something in me trembled with affection. He guided me through his display sketches of cityscapes, riversides, and faces of people who, I realized, were pieces of his life. Each one carried emotion in the lines, as if his pencil could breathe empathy. And then, near the end, I stopped. There it was, a large charcoal sketch titled, Still You. It was me, not posed, not idealized. Just me sitting by the river, hair loose, a small smile playing at my lips. The breeze hinted in the strokes. But what struck me most wasn't the accuracy. It was the expression he'd captured, peaceful, present, alive. My breath caught. You drew this. He nodded, his voice quiet. It's how I see you. I blinked back the sudden sting of tears. You even used the same words, I said, gesturing toward the title. Your bracelet, he said softly. You wear it often. It seemed fitting. I touched my wrist without thinking. The silver band gleamed under the gallery lights. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. No one had ever seen me that way. Before, not as someone to fix or impress, but as someone whole just as she was. Daniel, I whispered, thank you. He smiled. You don't need to thank me for seeing what's already there. After the show, we walked outside into the soft evening air. The city was quiet, and the golden streetlights made everything glow. Do you ever think, I said, breaking the silence, that we meet people when we're finally ready to be seen? He looked at me thoughtfully. Maybe. Or maybe they were always there, we just needed to open our eyes. We stood at the Guy corner, the gentle buzz of life around us, and something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't the electric pull of infatuation. It was the calm gravity of connection. He reached for my hand, slowly, as if asking without words. I didn't pull away. For a long moment, we just stood there, hand in hand, watching the lights flicker in the windows above. The world didn't shift dramatically. There was no soundtrack, no applause, just the quiet certainty that something new had begun. Over the next few weeks, we saw more of each other. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but something steady, thoughtful. He'd leave small notes in my mailbox, sketches of coffee cups, leaves, or the city skyline with captions like, "For your morning thoughts." I found myself smiling for no reason again, and yet there were moments when ghosts of the past tried to return. Sometimes I'd hear a song Evan used to play, or pass by the old apartment building where we'd once lived, and a dull ache would rise in my chest. But it wasn't longing, it was remembrance. The kind that comes when you've made peace with what's gone. One evening, as Daniel and I shared dinner at my place, I confessed, "Sometimes I still think about him. Not because I miss him, but because he taught me what not to settle for." Daniel looked at me with the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. "That's not weakness," he said. "That's healing." I smiled. Maybe it's both. He reached across the table and gently took my hand. "I don't need to replace your past, Lena. I just want to be part of your present." That line, so simple, so honest, sank deep into my heart. I realized then that love didn't have to be grand or consuming. It could be gentle, safe, the kind that makes room for who you were and who you're becoming. Later that night, after he left, I stood by the window, watching the city lights blur softly through the glass. I traced the rim of my bracelet and whispered, "Still me." It wasn't about who I loved now, or who I had loved before. It was about who I'd become, a woman who had walked through betrayal, found strength in solitude, and discovered love in the quiet spaces between endings and beginnings. For the first time, I didn't need anyone's approval to feel enough. I already was. That weekend, Mara visited. She noticed the framed sketch Daniel had given me and grinned. Well, someone looks happy," I laughed. "Someone looks at peace." "Same thing," she said, sipping her coffee. Then more softly, "You know, Lena, I always believed you'd find your way. You just had to stop waiting for permission." I nodded, smiling. It took me a while to realize I was the one holding the keys. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Keep them close. Don't ever hand them back." When she left that evening, I sat in the soft light of my living room, a quiet gratitude swelling inside me. I had once believed my story ended the night Evan called me boring. But now I knew that was the night it truly began. Autumn arrived in soft amber tones, wrapping the city in its calm golden hush. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke, and the evenings carried that wistful beauty that only comes when something is ending, or perhaps beginning again. By then, I had built a quiet rhythm that felt wholly mine. My pottery workshop had grown into something more than a hobby. I was teaching weekend classes now, guiding people through the same slow, grounding process that had healed me. Watching them mold imperfect lumps of clay into something beautiful reminded me daily how transformation often begins with our willingness to touch what's messy. Daniel was still around, a gentle constant. We weren't rushing toward anything. There were no grand declarations or promises written in stone. We simply were. And somehow that was more intimate than anything I'd known before. One chilly October afternoon, he stopped by the studio while I was cleaning up. His scarf was crooked, his hair dusted with light drizzle. "You look like someone who's been working too hard," he said with that teasing half smile. "Guilty," I replied, wiping my hands on a towel. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to show you something," he said, holding up a small envelope. "My next exhibit proposal. And I mentioned you." "Me?" I asked, surprised. He nodded. "There's a section about emotional realism, capturing people not in moments of perfection, but transformation. You're part of that." I blinked, unsure how to respond. "That's kind, but I'm not amused, Daniel." He smiled. "No, you're a reminder that people can start over and still stay true to themselves." Something inside me softened at his words. "You always know what to say." "Only because you inspire it," he said, and though it was simple, it landed deep. After he left, I sat in the quiet studio for a long time, his words echoing in my head. Start over. Stay true. That night, as the rain tapped softly against my window, I opened my old journal, the one I'd started the week I left Evan. Flipping through the pages, I saw a timeline of my transformation. The early entries were raw, heavy with grief and confusion. Then, slowly, the handwriting steadied. The words grew calmer. The entries turned from pain into reflection. One entry caught my eye. I keep thinking that healing means forgetting, but maybe it just means remembering without pain. Reading that now, I smiled. I had become the proof of my own words. A few days later, I got a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Lena. It's Sophie. I hope you don't mind me reaching out." My eyebrows lifted. It had been almost a year since I'd last heard from her. "Of course not," I replied. "How are you?" "Actually, I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "For being kinder than you needed to be that day at your house." I didn't realize then what kind of man Evan really was. I had to learn the hard way. I hesitated, then typed, "You don't owe me thanks, Sophie. We were both caught in someone else's storm." She replied with a single line that made me pause. "You're stronger than I was. I hope I can get there too." I stared at her message for a moment before responding. "You will. It starts when you stop believing that broken love is better than none." Her reply came a minute later. "Thank you. Truly." When I set the phone down, a strange calm filled me. I realized then that forgiveness didn't always come as a choice. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the shape of understanding. That evening, Daniel stopped by with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "You always look thoughtful when it rains," he said, handing me one. I laughed. "It's my philosopher season." He sat beside me on the couch, the soft jazz music filling the room. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I heard from someone from my past," I said. And I didn't feel angry, just at peace. He nodded. "That's when you know you've healed, when the ghosts stop haunting and start teaching." I looked at him, smiling. "You say things like that, and I start wondering if you're secretly writing poetry." He chuckled. "Only in my head." We sat there in comfortable silence, sipping chocolate, the city glowing outside. The rhythm of the rain blended with our breaths. There was no rush to define what we were or where we were going. It was enough just to exist in that moment. Weeks passed like that, steady, unhurried. I found joy in little things, the laughter of my students at the studio, the smell of cinnamon in the air, the way the sunlight poured across my living room floor in the mornings. One Sunday, I visited my old neighborhood. The apartment building Evan and I once shared was still there, its facade unchanged. I stood across the street for a while, watching someone new open the window, a woman humming to herself, hair tied loosely back, a cat brushing against her leg. It didn't hurt to see it. It didn't even feel nostalgic. Just distant. Like a story I once read and closed long ago. I whispered under my breath, "Thank you for the lessons," and turned away. As I walked home, I realized something simple yet profound. I had finally stepped out of my own shadow. Not because of Daniel, not because of revenge or closure, but because I'd learned to stand in the fullness of my own light again. That night, I placed a new page in my journal and wrote, "Some stories aren't meant to end with a grand finale. They end quietly with a woman learning that peace is the loudest kind of victory." I closed the book, set it aside, and blew out the candle. For the first time, I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like the author of my own life. Winter swept in with its quiet grace, blanketing the city in silver calm. The river froze along the edges, the air crisp and bright. I'd always dreaded winter before its stillness, its silence, but this year I welcomed it. There was something soothing about the pause it brought, a reminder that even nature rests before it blooms again. Life had found its gentle pace. My pottery studio flourished, with new students joining every month. The shelves were lined with imperfectly perfect creations, mugs, vases, bowls, each one telling a story of patience and transformation. I often watched my students shape clay, their brows furrowed, hands covered in earth, and I'd smile quietly. Healing looked like that, sometimes messy, uncertain, but full of potential. Daniel was still there, weaving through my days in the most natural way. We never defined what we were. We didn't have to. It was enough to share spaces of comfort, morning coffee runs, late-night conversations, small glances that said, "I see you." One snowy evening, I invited him over for dinner. The apartment was warm, filled with the scent of roasted garlic and herbs. I'd set the table simply, 2 candles flickering softly between us. He arrived with his usual smile, shaking the snow from his hair. "You're domestic tonight," he teased. "Don't get used to it," I said, laughing. "It's just soup." I burned the first batch. We sat, ate, and talked about art, travel, the books we were reading. It felt like the kind of evening that didn't need perfection to be beautiful. Halfway through dessert, he leaned back in his chair, studying me with that thoughtful look of his. "You know," he said softly, "you glow differently now." I raised an eyebrow. "Differently how?" "When I first met you, there was a quiet heaviness, like you were holding your breath. Now it's like you've exhaled." His words hit deeper than he probably intended. I smiled, tracing the rim of my cup. "I guess I finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell me I was enough." He nodded, his eyes gentle. "You always were." Silence settled between us, the kind that feels full, not empty. Then he reached across the table, his hand brushing mine, a question in his touch rather than a demand. I didn't pull away. The candlelight flickered, catching the silver bracelet on my wrist. Still you. It had become less of a reminder and more of a promise. After dinner, we sat on the couch, sipping tea. The snow outside made everything glow softly. Daniel glanced at my bookshelf and smiled. "You've got quite a collection now." "I started reading again after I left," I said. "It was like rediscovering old friends." He pulled out a book from the shelf, The Art of Simple Things. "This one's my favorite," he said. "It's about how the smallest choices can change everything." I nodded. Leaving was my smallest and biggest choice all at once. He turned toward me, his expression serious now. "Do you ever regret it?" I thought for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "But I do grieve what I thought we could have been. I think that's the part people don't talk about. You can let go and still grieve the dream." He smiled faintly. "That's what makes you human, Lena." For a moment, his words hung between us, soft and true. Then quietly, he said, "You've become the kind of woman people write stories about." I laughed lightly. "I think I've had enough drama for one lifetime." "Not drama," he corrected. "Depth." It was such a small exchange, but it lingered with me long after he left that night. Later, as I stood by the window watching the snowfall, I thought about how far I'd come from the woman whose heart broke quietly under the weight of indifference to the one now at peace with solitude and connection alike. The next morning, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name in familiar handwriting. Evans, I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small photograph, the two of us from years ago. Laughing at some forgotten joke, the world's still simple. The letter read, "Lena, I found this while packing up the last of my things." It reminded me of when we were happy before we both forgot how to be kind. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm grateful you walked away when you did. It forced me to change. I'm seeing someone now, someone good, and I treat her differently because of you. Thank you for teaching me through your silence. I hope life gives you the peace I took from you for so long." I read it twice, then placed the photo and letter in my keepsake box. It didn't hurt. It didn't even surprise me. It just felt complete. That evening, I told Daniel about it as we walked by the river, our breath visible in the cold air. He listened quietly, then said, "Do you want to talk about it?" I shook my head. "No, I just wanted you to know that it didn't break me." He smiled. "I think you're unbreakable now." "Not unbreakable," I said softly. "Just whole." We stopped near the railing where we first met months ago. The river shimmered under the city lights, frozen but still moving beneath the surface, a reminder that stillness doesn't always mean stagnation. Daniel turned to me, his eyes reflecting the light. "Lena," he said quietly, "what do you want next?" I looked out at the skyline, at the beauty of what had been and what was yet to come. "I don't know," I admitted. "But for once, I'm not afraid to find out." He smiled. "Then I'd like to find out with you." I met his gaze, and for the first time, I didn't question whether I was ready. I simply nodded. As we walked home, the snow began to fall again soft. Steady, forgiving, and I thought, maybe this is what love should feel like. Not a storm, not a test, but a quiet snowfall, unexpected, gentle, and strong enough to change the landscape without a sound. The new year arrived quietly, without fanfare. No fireworks, no loud parties, just me and Daniel sitting on the balcony, bundled under blankets, watching the city below light up like a living constellation. It was the kind of celebration I'd always wanted, simple, sincere, full of peace instead of noise. Last year feels like a lifetime ago, I said, sipping my tea. Daniel smiled, his breath fogging in the cold air. That's because it was a lifetime ago, the one you left behind. I nodded. Sometimes it still surprises me how far I've come. I used to think healing would look like forgetting, but it's more like remembering without hurting. That's growth, he said, not pretending the past didn't happen, just refusing to let it define what comes next. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint hum of the city and the soft crackle of fireworks in the distance. He reached over and squeezed my hand gently. To new beginnings, he said. To new beginnings, I echoed, smiling. It wasn't a vow. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a promise to the moment to be present, to allow joy without fear. Over the next few weeks, life unfolded in small, lovely ways. My pottery classes filled up, my apartment plants thrived despite my inconsistent watering, and Daniel's art exhibit was officially accepted. We started spending weekends exploring nearby towns, small cafes, bookshops, and antique stores that seemed frozen in time. One Saturday, while we were walking through a winter market, I noticed an elderly couple sharing a pastry, laughing at something private. Their ease with each other, the comfort of shared silence and small gestures made my chest ache in a sweet, unexpected way. That, I said softly, nodding toward them. That's what peace looks like. Daniel followed my gaze, then turned back to me. We're not them, he said gently. We're our own kind of peace, I smiled. I like ours better. That afternoon, he took me to a small art supply store and handed me a blank canvas. For your next creation, he said. I laughed. I make things with clay, not paint. Doesn't matter, he said. You've rebuilt your life piece by piece this time. You get to color it too. When I got home, I placed the canvas on my desk. For days I stared at it, unsure where to start. Then, one evening, I dipped a brush into soft shades of gold and gray, not perfect, not planned, and just began. By the time I finished, it wasn't art anyone else would admire, but it was mine. Abstract and honest. When I looked at it in the morning light, I realized it looked like the river, the same one I used to cry beside, the same one where I'd met Daniel, now rendered in soft, warm hues. Transformation captured in brushstrokes. I signed the corner quietly, Lena C. That evening, I invited Daniel over. When he saw the painting, he smiled. It's beautiful, he said. It's flawed, I corrected. He shook his head. That's what makes it beautiful. We spent the night cooking together, the kitchen filled with laughter and the smell of burnt garlic bread. It felt easy not because life was perfect, but because I no longer needed it to be. Later, as we sat on the couch, I turned to him. Can I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever worry about falling in love again? I mean, after everything you've been through? He thought for a moment. I used to, he admitted. I was scared of repeating old mistakes, of losing myself again. But with you, it doesn't feel like falling. It feels like walking steady, grounded, somewhere worth going. His words sank into me like warmth after a long chill. That's the kind of love I want, I said softly. He smiled. Then stop worrying about wanting it. You're already living it. It took me a long time to understand how true that was. That night, after he left, I stood in front of the mirror, my reflection illuminated by the city lights. I didn't see the woman who had once been betrayed or the one who had plotted small revenge to reclaim her power. I saw someone entirely new, a woman who had forgiven, rebuilt, and dared to open her heart again. And for the first time, I said it out loud. I love who I'm becoming. The words felt strange, but right like speaking a truth that had been waiting patiently inside me all along. In the weeks that followed, I wrote again, not journal entries this time, but short essays and reflections. Stories about women finding strength in quiet ways, about learning that peace can be louder than pain. I didn't plan to publish them, but one of my students, a young woman named Elise, found one on my desk one day. "Ms. Cartwright," she said, holding the paper shyly. This made me cry. "You should share it," I smiled, embarrassed but touched. "Maybe one day." "Not maybe," she insisted. "The world needs this kind of softness." Her words stayed with me. That night, I opened a blank document and began typing again my story this time. Not just the pain, but the healing. Not the revenge, but the rediscovery. As I wrote, I realized something powerful. I wasn't just telling my story. I was closing it. The last sentence came easily. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is choosing yourself and meaning it. When I finally hit save, I felt it, that quiet, full-circle peace that comes only when you've lived every word. I leaned back. The room bathed in the soft glow of my lamp and smiled. I had begun this journey as a woman silenced by her husband's cruel laughter. Now I was a woman who told her own story, not to hurt, not to impress, but to heal, and maybe, just maybe, to help someone else do the same. The months rolled gently into spring again, the same season that had once marked my leaving, now reborn with the quiet grace of something healed. My balcony garden, once sparse and shy, bloomed into color lavender, mint, daisies, and small yellow tulips that seemed to smile at the morning light. I'd planted them on a whim, not realizing how symbolic they'd feel later. Renewal, growth, life after stillness. My days had a rhythm that felt sacred now. I'd wake early, make tea, sit on the balcony, and write. The book I'd started, the one Elise had encouraged me to finish, was slowly taking shape. It wasn't a revenge story or a tragedy. It was something softer, truer, a chronicle of rediscovery, of how a woman found herself in the silence she once feared. Daniel came over often, though we still maintained our separate spaces. It wasn't distance. It was balance. We had both lived lives where love meant losing pieces of ourselves, and now, we were careful tenderly so to never repeat that mistake. One morning, he stopped by unannounced, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. "Before you open it," he said, "just know it's not an occasion." I just saw it and thought of you. I smiled, untying the twine carefully. Inside was a delicate pottery tool, hand-carved, the handle etched with tiny silver lines that caught the light. It was beautiful, functional, understated, I thought, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Since you help others shape things, you should have something that reminds you of your own craft." I turned the tool over in my hand, touched by the thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," I said quietly. "You're perfect," he smiled, a little sheepish. "I just pay attention." And that was exactly it. He did pay attention to the small details, the quiet pauses, the moments most people overlook. Later that afternoon, we went for a walk by the river, our place. The air smelled of rain and earth, and the trees were just beginning to bud again. "You know," I said, watching the water move lazily, "it's strange. I used to come here to cry. Now I come here to breathe." Daniel smiled. "Maybe the river didn't change, maybe you did." "Maybe," I said. "But I think it's both." We sat down on a bench, watching the sunlight dance across the ripples. He reached into his sketchbook and flipped to a new page, another drawing of me. This time it wasn't somber or reflective. It was joyful, me laughing, eyes closed, wind tangling my hair. "You drew this from memory?" I asked, surprised. He nodded. "I like capturing you in motion. You're most yourself when you're not trying to be anything." I stared at the drawing, warmth spreading in my chest. "You see me better than I see myself sometimes." "That's because you're finally looking without guilt," he said softly. "And that's when people shine the brightest." I didn't reply. I just leaned my head on his shoulder, the quiet hum of the city folding around us like a lullaby. That evening when I got home, I sat by my desk and opened my laptop. The book was nearly done, just one chapter left. I reread what I had written so far, tracing the journey of a woman who'd started as invisible and ended as whole. The last line was waiting for me, hovering in my thoughts for days, but I finally knew what it needed to say. Sometimes life doesn't give you the ending you expected, it gives you the strength to write a better one. When I typed the final period, I felt tears rise, not of sadness but of release. I emailed the draft to a small independent publisher recommended by one of my students. I didn't expect much. I didn't need much. The act of finishing it was enough. But just a few weeks later, I received an email with the subject line, "We'd love to publish your story." I read it twice before the meaning sank in. My heart raced, and I covered my mouth with my hands. For a moment, I just sat there, stunned, laughing and crying at once. When I told Daniel that evening, his grin could have lit the room. "See," he said, wrapping his arms around me. "The world was waiting for your voice." "It's strange," I said through tears. "I used to think my story ended the night I swapped his shampoo. But maybe that was just the beginning," he chuckled softly. "Some stories need a little chaos before they find their calm." We celebrated with takeout and wine, sitting on the floor surrounded by the hum of the city. The laughter came easily, light and unforced. I didn't know what the future would bring, but I wasn't afraid anymore. That night, lying in bed, I thought about everything that had led me here, the pain, the small acts of rebellion, the tears that watered my strength. I had lost so much, but in the quiet rebuilding, I had found everything that mattered: freedom, peace, purpose. As I drifted to sleep, I thought about Evan not with anger, but with a quiet gratitude. He had called me boring once, and for a long time I'd believed him. But what he'd really meant was that I was steady, thoughtful, grounded qualities he couldn't understand because he'd never stood still long enough to appreciate them. I wasn't boring. I was brave, and I had finally built a life that reflected that truth. The next morning, I woke to the sun spilling across my floor, golden and warm. I made coffee, stepped onto the balcony, and breathed in the scent of blooming tulips. The city stretched before me alive, unpredictable, beautiful, and for the first time in years, I didn't wonder what would come next. I just smiled, lifted my cup to the morning light, and whispered, "Still me." The book launch took place on a soft, breezy evening in early summer, the kind of day that felt like a quiet exhale from the universe. The small independent bookstore smelled of paper and promise, filled with people who'd read the early reviews and wanted to hear "The Woman Who Turned Heartbreak into Art." I stood at the front, a copy of Still Me in my hands, the title chosen not just for the bracelet that had once symbolized survival, but for the journey that followed. When I looked up, my eyes met familiar faces: Mara in the front row, her smile proud and teary, my students clutching copies of the book, and near the back, Daniel leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, eyes soft and steady. I began to speak. My voice trembled at first, but it grew stronger with every sentence. "I used to think strength meant holding things together, even when they were falling apart," I said. "But now I know that real strength sometimes means letting go, walking away, even when love begs you to stay. This book isn't about revenge or endings. It's about beginnings, about choosing peace when chaos feels familiar, about remembering that no one gets to define your worth but you." There was silence when I finished, the kind that feels full, not empty. Then, applause, gentle at first, then warm and genuine. Afterward, people came up to thank me, to tell me their own stories. Women whispered about marriages they were afraid to leave. Men spoke about learning gentleness too late. And a few simply said, "Thank you." When the crowd thinned, Daniel approached, holding a small wrapped parcel. "For the author," he said, smiling. Inside was a framed sketch, the one he'd drawn months ago, me laughing, alive, wind in my hair. Below it, he'd written in small, careful letters, "Still you, always you." I looked up at him, my eyes stinging. "You've been part of every page, you know." "I know," he said softly. "But you wrote it all yourself." He was right. As the evening faded, we walked outside. The sky was streaked with violet and gold, and the air smelled like summer rain. I slipped my hand into his, the city lights flickering like quiet applause. Somewhere in the distance, music played slow, timeless, familiar. I leaned into him and whispered, "You know what's funny? For years I thought my story ended when my husband called me boring." Daniel smiled. "And now?" "Now," I said, my voice calm, certain, "I know that's when it truly began." We kept walking, the rhythm of our steps syncing with the city's heartbeat, steady, unhurried, alive, and somewhere deep inside, the woman I used to be quiet, overlooked, underestimated, finally smiled too, because she had made it, because she had stayed true, because she was still her.